All right, so I was preparing for class and I was reminded that today is Yom HaShoah, the holiday in which we remember the Holocaust. And I thought that it would be remiss of me just to ignore that. So I have sent a copy of a poem. It's actually a pretty famous poem by a poet named Paul Celan called Totes Fugue, which means death fugue. It's this guy's most famous poem, but I'm not really that interested in Celan himself. I'm interested in this poem because it's one of the most important contemporary renderings of the Holocaust, and particularly it connects with a number of different verses in the Torah, which are important to keep in mind. So I hope it's okay that I decided to do this with everybody. I know it's not what you expected, but
oh yes, sir. I would love to hear it. Thank you, Rabbi.
well, thank you. I'm glad you. I'm noticing you're the only one who responded, so I'm a little worried.
No, it's good.
Okay, so normally I don't do something like this, but I thought this was important enough to make a special case of it. So what you have here is an English translation of the poem. And if we decide we want to go and read the original German, we can do that. Celan himself was not German, was a Jew from Romania, but he wrote the poem in German. And after we read it, you'll understand why he did. This poem has certain elements that recall the musical form of the fugue, but it's not strictly adhering to that. Mostly, it is a kind of, what it has in common with the fugue is the repetition of certain phrases. In the fugue, it's musical phrases or musical ideas. Here it's poetic, but it's an attempt to not so much to explain, but to provide a way of thinking about what the Holocaust is or was. And therefore, it's also a very important poem in understanding how we connect our history, our literary history, and our theological history, and so forth, to our current awareness. That is the enterprise of interpreting any holy text. So it has a lot to do with what we're trying to accomplish by reading the Torah. Okay, enough of introduction. I think what I'm going to do is just to read the poem and ask you to follow along and to listen. And we'll go back and look at the poem in some detail. There are a number of well-known translations. This is one of them. It's probably not the most common, but it's pretty well known. So, Death Fugue. Black milk of daybreak, we drink it at evening. We drink it at midday and morning. We drink it at night. We drink and we drink. We shovel a grave in the air. There you won't lie too cramped. A man lives in the house. He plays with his vipers. He writes and writes when it grows dark to Deutschland, your golden hair, Margarita. He writes it and steps out of doors, and the stars are all sparkling. He whistles his hounds to come close. He whistles his Jews into rows, has them shovel a grape in the ground. He orders us strike up and play for the dance. Black milk of daybreak, we drink you at night. We drink you at morning and midday. We drink you at evening. We drink and we drink. A man lives in the house. He plays with his vipers. He writes when it goes dark to Deutschland, your golden hair, Margarita, your ashen hair, Shulamit. We shovel a grave in the air. There you won't be too cramped. He shouts, jab this earth deeper. You lot there, you others sing up and play. He grabs for the rod in his belt. He swings it. His eyes are blue. Jab your spades deeper. There are others pay on for the dancing. Black milk of daybreak, we drink you at night. We drink you at, please don't move it while I'm reading. Wait until I get to the end of a paragraph. Black milk of daybreak, we drink you at night. We drink you at midday and morning. We drink you at evening. We drink and we drink. A man lives in the house. Your goldenness, Har Margarita. Your ashen is Har Shulamit. He plays with his vipers. He shouts, play death more sweetly. Death is a master from Deutschland. He shouts, scrape your strings darker. You'll rise then in smoke to the sky. You'll have a grave then in the clouds where you won't lie too cramped. Black milk of daybreak, we drink you at night. We drink you at midday. Death is a master from Deutschland. We drink you at evening and morning. We drink and we drink. This death is ein Meister aus Deutschland. His eye, it is blue. He shoots you with shot made of lead. He shoots you level and true. A man lives in the house, your goldenness, hair Margarita. He looses his hounds on us, grants us a grave in the air. He plays with his vipers and daydreams. Their talk is ein Meister aus Deutschland. Dein goldenes Herr Margareta, dein ashenes Herr Shulamit. Well, there are some things that are pretty clear in the poem. Other things maybe not so much. So who do you think Margarita and Shulamit are? Anybody? Margarita of the golden hair and Shulamit, who has ashen hair. Who do they represent?
I would think with the golden hair, I would think it represented a German.
Yes, I think so. And what about the ashen hair?
That's death, I guess.
Well, death, but I think more specifically, Jews.
Jew?
Yeah, yeah. So those are two figures in the poem that are in opposition to each other. So you
And
have
maybe Margarita is also Mary.
Margarita comes from the poem by Faust. So it's actually a pretty symbolic name in that sense as well. Anybody know where we get Shulamit from? Who Shulamit was?
Shulamit.
No? Well, Shulamit is a figure in the Torah, and particularly one of the women who marries David, if I'm remembering correctly. So what's going on in the poem? What's the action in the poem?
Well, there's this thing of drinking and drinking and drinking.
Yeah, drinking and drinking as in perhaps getting drunk. But what else is happening? That's one. There's this drinking in of the black milk of daybreak, or in other translations, the black milk of dawn.
Well,
Uh,
it's the action, the actions of the people, especially in the first, well, the whole thing, it's repetitious. It's really how the German country, and I agree with Kirby that Margaret represent more of Germany, because in that sentence it grows dark to Deutschland, your golden air Margaret, you
yes,
know, and you have the shovel and then the grave, and
yeah, that's one of the major uh, events, so to speak, in the poem. They are digging a grave,
yeah.
but does anything get put in the grave?
Well, there's a one reference about making a grave in the air to give them more space.
Yeah, yeah. That might ring a bell in terms of the concept of Hitler's of Lebensraum, the need to create more space. So putting Jews in the graves was a part of their program to create more space for themselves. That was why the Germans attacked Russia. Yeah,
Yeah. Could it also be that you're put into by burning people, you've put them into air,
yes,
and so it could be a reference to that also,
absolutely.
rather than into a grave in the ground.
Yeah, but it's, yeah, you'd have to say that it is a very impermanent kind of grave.
Yeah,
Because
and
then-
also
Go ahead, Remy.
in that you have the violence. You have the belt. He swings and his eyes are blue.
Yeah.
The last, and I feel like I have seen so many movies on the Holocaust. I don't know
Yeah,
why I just gravitate on those movies.
yeah,
So this depiction, this poem, it's just it reminds me of all the movies, different producers, different
Mhm.
angles, and it's showing it in this poem that you are showing to us.
Sure. I think that's a very good point. And the interesting thing about the point you just made is that the representations of the Holocaust don't necessarily convey what the Holocaust was about. We see documentaries, but the documentaries themselves don't really express the reality of the Holocaust. The Holocaust, in terms of what it really means, is not just about the death of human beings. It's about there being no place for them in the earth, and that was the whole rationale of the Holocaust. Where is there a space? Only space in the sky, and we can't identify who or what they are. So, so that's part of what's going on.
Uh, Rabbi,
Yes, ma'am.
can I make a comment about
Of
this?
course.
Because it's also, to me, the Holocaust, it's not just about the number of people who've died.
Mhm.
It's and like you said, Hitler, he was creating more space for the German people.
Yeah.
And I'm always thinking also to accumulate the wealth that he took from the Jewish people.
Yes.
And I think it can happen in our own country, 21st century, that being complicit to the horrible, evil happenings.
Yes.
And I even now I'm saying, how did that happen? It can happen to any group of people. You
you
know,
Do you
so
see anywhere in the poem where there's a reference to sort of the actuality that you're talking about? Any lines here that express the everyday reality uh, that sort of wraps itself around the Holocaust? Anything here that reminds us of the actual events?
yeah, he writes it and step out of doors, and the stars are all sparkling. He whistles his horns to come as if there's nothing. People were not being affected. The stars are shining, the sun, and all of that. Anyway,
I think those are all very good references. The one that always strikes me is that there's a man who lives in the house. We don't know who this man is, but he seems to be unaffected by the events that are going on around him. A man lives in the house, you're golden as hair, Margarita. He looses his hounds on us and grants us a grave in the air. And that's kind of an amazing idea, to be granted a grave in the air. I mean, what happens? What kind of grave is this? And what happens to it? It's the smoke from the crematoria. But what happens to that smoke?
Yep. That what you just said, Rabbi, reminds me there was a special show on PBS. This is a while back.
Yeah.
Where there is a town only a mile where they have the Jews, and then there was a fence, and the people in the town were unaware or were not interested on what was happening in that area. It's fenced.
Yeah.
And when they discovered the people, it sounded like that they were not burning, they just starved the Jews that they put there. So when the soldiers came in, they were all skeleton, still alive.
Sure.
And what the Allied powers did, they made the members of that town that's only a mile to walk and look at those people who died, require them to see the people inside who have died and who are almost dead.
Yeah. I think.
But does this connect at all to any? I know we don't have a lot of ideas about heaven, but it's kind of heaven, the grave in the air. There's a release.
That's a very interesting interpretation. I think there's something to support that. But the thing about the graves in the air, what happens to smoke when it's in the air?
It dissipates.
It dissipates. It disappears. It doesn't last. It's not a memorial. It's not something that we can visit.
Also, it seems connected to sacrifices.
Very good point. So it's sort of the anti-sacrifice. Although there are people who think of the folks who died in the Holocaust as being a kind of sacrifice. I'm not always very comfortable with that interpretation, but other people have thought about it. So we have the grave, which are there, that the people are digging, and we have the grave that is granted to them in the air. To me, it always conjures up the idea that the memory of the Holocaust is very fragile, very impermanent, and over time becomes, to use Kim's word, dissipated. It's kind of like how we might picture a memory.
And that's why you wanted us to read this poem today, to keep it from dissipating.
That's right. That's exactly right. And the thing is, uh, when we speak about reading the Torah, why is it that we read the Torah? Why is it that we read Torah all the way through once every year, and then we start it again and read it again?
Well, we say to remember, right?
Yes, to remember, and it requires constant repetition to remember what it really means. So, I mean, I think that that's what Ceylon is doing here. He uses repetition in the poem to sort of emphasize certain images that he wants us to be especially aware of. So the golden hair Margarita, the ashen hair Shulamit, these are the two opposing figures that we remember. I think we're sometimes in danger of forgetting about Shulamit or about the golden hair of Marguerite. You know, as the years go by, the impulse to give up on the particularity of the events of the Holocaust become greater and greater. And there is criticism even today. Why do we Jews harp on this? Why do we think about it and keep reminding ourselves and other people about it? I think it's because the memories are they're evanescent. When we don't work to remember them, they disappear. And that's so that, you know, the grave where the remembrance vanishes. How do you maintain the memory of something when there is no um, physical entity that represents it? And of course, with regard to the Holocaust, how could there be such a physical entity? By definition, what there is not anything that's a physical reminder. We can look at the buildings, we can look at things of that sort, but the memory, insofar as it relates to human beings, is gone. And with each passing year and the number of survivors decreases, it's more and more gone. So eventually, it's hard to know what will happen to that memory. And Remy, you brought this up in a indirect way. The importance of this poem is not only with regard to the Holocaust. It's about many other examples, not just of genocide, but of loss. We forget about what we have lost. We forget the reality, the feelings, the tangible qualities of the people and the events that have gone from view. And I was just at a Passover Seder virtual one with my sister and my son and my daughter-in-law and one of my nieces. And we're talking about all these events that happened when my father was alive. And some of them were ones that I remembered very well. And some of them were ones that I had kind of forgotten. I've kind of lost their significance. I think that happens to a lot of us. We talk to people in our families. We remember some of the things that happened that were very important at the time, but somehow these memories have become, have disappeared, or we need to be reminded of them. So this poem has that kind of function. I want to talk for just a second, though, about this image of the black milk. Does anybody have a suggestion about what that might be, or what might.
It is that. You know, have you ever seen black milk? Milk is usually white. If
Yes.
it's black, that means it's tainted. And if it's really black, it's almost poison. To me, drinking black milk is you're heading down there to the grave. That's what
So,
when I saw.
With the repeating lines, it suggests a grim, grinding monotony.
yes, I think that that is a very important point, Kirby, because when you talk to people who are um, survivors of the camp, one of the things that they point out is the sameness, the unending, what do I want to say, monotony of what occurred to them. Every day was a day in which they're bombarded with death.
And
And there's no relief.
night is kind of not to be mentioned because I think it's death. There was something in the Talmud where there was a prayer that was supposed to be said at night, but they said instead it's supposed to be said in the day because they didn't want to mention the word night.
Well, I'm not sure I'm recalling exactly what you have in mind.
But there's a real negative
Well,
connotation to the night.
well, there are certain things that we don't do at night. For example, now this isn't true in Reformed congregations universally, but in traditional congregations, we don't read Torah at night. And the reason is that according to the Midrash, Torah was given during the day, so that it was a public event. Night is a time where events are hidden. So, revelation doesn't happen at night; it happens during the day. This is not true just of Judaism. That's why Jesus rises in the daytime. It's not. It's also for the same reason. I mean, there is a kind of parallel. So, in any event, so we have this guy who lives in the house, who plays with his snakes or his vipers. Who are the vipers?
Could be the dogs. I think this is a gang boss that we're talking about, and they certainly had dogs. I don't know if the vipers are the dogs.
Well, that's a good question. There is a reference to the dogs in the poem.
He whistles his hounds to come close.
Yes. So in the Torah, where do you get a reference to vipers or snakes?
Well, when the Israelites were in the wilderness, and I'm trying to remember the sin, but they could be saved from the sin by gazing at the bronze serpent that Moses held up.
Yeah. So oddly enough, in one sense, it could be a positive image, but the thing that comes to my mind most readily is the story of the Garden of Eden, where the viper or the snake is the embodiment of seduction and evil and so on and so forth.
And that connects to the rod in his belt. Both what Kirby's referring to and
yeah, I mean, there are a couple of different interpretations that can be given. And it's, complex enough poem that it certainly bears more than one interpretation.
Would the vipers also represent, one said, seduction, or even having good time with his wife or girlfriend? Well,
that's an interesting question. The rabbi's view of the snakes or the vipers is very interesting because typically when we read the story of the Garden of Eden, we think of the snake as seducing Eve. But that's not the rabbi's view. The rabbis really think of that as being more self-seduction. He is very smart, and he takes advantage of her own weakness. So, for example, one of the things that the rabbis point out is that when Eve repeats what she understood Adam to have heard from God, she changes it. It now is, when he says that there's going to be death, that's not what Eve says. Does anybody remember what Eve says?
Well, this snake tempted me. It's all the snake's fault.
Well, that's true. That's true. But how is the snake able to latch on to that? What's the fault, or what's the distortion in Eve's recounting of what Adam says to her?
I think Eve said, the serpent made me. I think she used the word made. I forgot, but.
Yeah, she does. But how would that impact her? What's the flaw in what she says that he latches on to?
Well, basically, if I remember it correctly, basically he's saying, the serpent that you created, kind of blaming God.
Yeah.
He made me do this.
Okay, let's look it up. It really matters exactly what you said. Can anybody look it up quickly and see what the actual statement is?
Let me see if I can find it.
It's 1 o'clock.
Okay, it's Genesis 3.
Mm-hmm.
Can I read it, Rabbi?
Of course.
He said, well, now the serpent was more cunning than the beast of the field, which the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, as God indeed said, you shall not eat every tree of the garden. And the woman said to the serpent, we may eat the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is the midst of the garden, God has said, you shall not eat it, nor you shall touch, lest you die. Then
okay, wait a minute. Is that true? Is that what God said?
That's what it says.
She's quoting. She's quoting, and she's not quoting correctly.
Yeah, you are so right, Rabbi.
She adds that if you even touch the tree, you'll die. But that's not what God says, and it's not what Adam told her God said. She adds that herself. And the snake takes advantage of that. See, touch the fruit. What happens? Nothing happens. That is the weakness of her statement that the snake latches onto. Okay, you with me? So
the snake has kind of possessed her in that.
well, not in a how do I put it? He's possessed her. He's taken advantage of her misapprehension. She has added on to the quote that she got from Adam, and as a result, the snake can take advantage of that and delude her.
Kind of gives her a bad name, doesn't it? That she can be deluded.
Well, it's human behavior. We always do this. Okay, we do this when we deal with our children. But you better not do that, or something's going to happen. And when we do that, something's going to happen. We always make it worse than we would otherwise understand it to be. If you, my favorite example is if you keep making faces, one of these days, your face is going to freeze like that.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, what does that mean?
Rabbi, I have a
Yes.
question regarding what you
Okay.
just said.
Yeah,
Ah,
sure.
like you said, she changed. I thought it's Eve that she changed. It's almost like she added some aspect of what God said, and it's
Mhm.
almost like a commentary. Did I say
Yes,
that correctly? So
that's exactly right.
so we really have, you and I or all of us have to study when we're reading. We really have to read between the lines, because after a while that commentaries can change the original meaning of the verse, of the story,
Which is
right?
why the rabbis uh, make a lot of attribute a lot of importance to the idea that you're not allowed to add to or detract from the words of the Torah. You've got to have it right. Why? Because things depend upon the actual meaning. So you have to be careful that you don't, even out of enthusiasm or uh, uh, what I want to say, love of the text, to distort it, either by making it more strict or less strict, more inclusive or less inclusive. And this is where the error is introduced. It's not something that's especially uh, key to Eve. It's a human frailty. And we do this even in everyday language. So the reason I think it's important is to understand that when we're dealing with um, the Holocaust or any other historical event, you have to spend a lot of time to make sure that you're not distorting the meaning. That's very hard to do. We're almost never in a situation where the meaning is absolutely clear. So there's a certain amount of humility we have to have in dealing with the text. So one last point, um, because we're getting near the end of our time. The oh, where did it go? What do you make of the reference to the stars? He writes it and steps out of doors. I'm sorry, where did it go?
Here.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, thank you. He writes it and steps out of doors, and the stars are all sparkling. He whistles his hounds to come close. He whistles his Jews into rows. He has them grovel the grave in the ground, shovel grave in the ground. He orders us strike up and play for the dance. Now, this is obviously a reference to the orchestras that were constructed in the various death camps. Some are more famous than others, but they would play classical music as the Jews were being marched into the camp.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
And to think about the attempt to mask what was really happening by taking some very important elements of human culture and presenting them as if that is somehow essential to what's going on, when it's really just a cover for what's going on.
And it sounds like the gang boss is enjoying this.
Oh, I agree.
Yeah.
The orchestras were playing for the benefit of the guards.
Yes,
Which
yes.
was to make it somehow a more palatable experience. So the thing about the Holocaust is, well, one thing about it is that there are various ways in which we try to obscure what really happened. And I say that only because we are in the midst of a period of time where the realities, the historical realities of the Holocaust are under debate. And there are attempts by various people and various movements to deny the historicity of the Holocaust. The idea to somehow mask what really happened is very, very easy to understand. It was so outrageously evil. Who could believe it?
Yep.
And that's part of what's going on. Yeah, I saw a
Rabbi,
hand. Oh, Rabbi,
uh,
yeah.
Rabbi, I want to make, you were asking a question a few minutes ago,
Uh-huh.
what the Holocaust, the way it happened to me, usually people just work 8 to 5 or 8 to 6. Like
Yeah.
you said, the Torah, you don't read Torah at night or something like that. But in the first stanza of the poem, we
Yeah.
drink it, we drink black milk at evening, we drink it at midday, we drink it at night, and we drink and drink. So that evil happened 24/7, nonstop.
Very good point. Yeah, it's a constant, something we constantly take in, and it's very hard to protect yourself against that. When we think about the way our society works and the way our culture works, there are all sorts of things which are meant to, here's a nice word, to prettify what's happening, as if somehow it makes a difference. This is one reason why Jewish funerals are very different from other funerals. There's no flowers at a Jewish funeral. It's not meant to be beautiful. It is a reality which is painful and what do I say? It's painful, and we don't want to obscure the pain that's involved with it by making it look better than it was. That's part of why this poem is as powerful as it is. Okay, we are at the end of our time, I believe. Oh, no, not quite. We have 5 minutes. So what do you think happens if you take this seriously? So you're drinking the black milk of daybreak. What is the sky like at daybreak?
It's warm, colored. The sun rising, the red.
Yeah. How do we describe it, though, commonly?
Misty.
When is it darkest?
It's probably, to me, the darkest is probably morning, because the evil can be seen a lot more in the daylight with the sun than when it's being done in the dark. So when you see evil and understand it, it's very painful when you know that it's happening and you cannot do anything. Think about the pain and suffering of those people that could see it happening.
Yeah, but I want to point out one thing about that. In the day, there is a certain kind of obscuring that takes place as well. When do you see evil most readily? At night, when there isn't light, or during the day, when the sun is out?
Well, I have a commentary on this, Rabbi.
Okay.
I think evil prevails and seeps in when it's in the dark. Like Washington Post says their mantra, democracy dies in darkness. So when it is dark, we don't see it. But I think when it's bright, the people who knows better, there's more pain and suffering. So it depends on the individual looking out or knowing it.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would agree with that. Uh, I'm not entirely sure, and the reason I'm not entirely sure is we have this expression: it's always darkest before.
Before it's light, I don't know.
The dawn.
Dawn.
Yeah, it's darkest before the dawn. So I think the idea is that at the moment when we're transitioning to the light of day, that oddly enough is the darkest time. Any reason to think that there might be some value in that? What is it that is the characteristic of trying to see things at the dawn hour or during daybreak?
We have hope at that time.
Well, we do, but is that when we see things most clearly?
When there is light, we see more clearly.
That's true, or when it's just dark. But at the time of daybreak, our eyes are actually often tricked. It's when we find it most difficult to see clearly. So I don't know. I mean, you would think that if there's more light, that necessarily means we see better. But in the transition from darkness to light, I think the images that we see are confusing. And what's the word I'm looking for?
Maybe mirages would be more prevalent
Well, maybe so.
when there's more moisture.
Maybe so. Yeah, I think when we're in that period of transition, it's hard to see things clearly. I think we're often confused by what we see. It's kind of easy to see during the day, and it's actually pretty easy to see comparatively when it's dark, if there's a full moon, whatever it is. But at that point when it is not light enough to see like it's the daytime, or dark enough like you have a full moon and so forth, that's the time when we are least likely to see things clearly.
Rabbi,
Likely to be confused. Yes.
yeah, I'm thinking I'm with you on that. I feel like, however, given the situation of the Holocaust, usually when you're at night, when you had a good sleep in the morning,
Mhm.
as you rested your brain, you can see better, you can think, you're fresh. But in the situation of the Holocaust, I am assuming those people did not get any rest, even during the night.
I'm sure they didn't sleep well. That's for sure.
Hello.
Rabbi, I want to get a question in before we leave. You
Yes.
said Celan was Romanian. Is that correct?
I believe he was Romanian.
Then it's interesting. Why did he write in the language tied to genocide? What's the message there?
That is a great point, Kirby. First and foremost, I think Celan wrote the poem for Germans to read. You know, so that would be practically point number one. But German as a language in the 19th and the early 20th century was regarded as the language of science and reason and philosophy as part of Western culture. So it was the language that expressed most clearly what was supposed to be the highest values of Western culture. So it is ironic that the poem about the Holocaust is in German. Kind of, it's not what you would expect. It's kind of a confounding understanding. All right. So look, this is a wonderful poem. We've touched the surface, but I wanted you to have some familiarity with it.
I really appreciate your bringing it to our attention. This is
Yeah,
very
thank
You're very
good.
welcome. I
Really
thought
Thank you,
appreciate it.
sir. I'm gonna read it more, sir, Rabbi. Thank you
Please
for
do.
enlightening me on this. No, thank you.
you will also find, by the way, some very interesting material on Ceylon himself, but also on this particular poem online. If you just go to Wikipedia, there's quite a lot of information on it that would be very helpful. So I hope this was useful to everybody,
Very good.
and we'll get back to our normal our, our normal business next week.
Thank you, sir. Have a good week.
Yes, you
Have
too.
a good Shabbat.
Okay,
Thank you.
Shabbat. Thank you.